Welcome to the S.O.A.P Bible Study Series from Oak Tree Community Church in South Bend, Indiana. We're working our way through the first gospel, the Gospel of Matthew, and we are just starting the second half at this point.
Yep.
Right? Chapter 15.
Yeah, so chapter 15, and we go through 15 through 18,
About
but halfway through 18.
Yeah, about 3.5 chapters this week.
Yeah, so you get some fun reading there.
Yeah, so we did 12 through 14 last week, and there was a major...
Jesus had presented himself as the Messiah. It was like, okay, here's what's going to happen. All you have to do is say yes, right? And, and the Pharisees and Sadducees said something, but it wasn't yes. Right. So he was rejected.
Yeah.
So we think, oh, Jesus didn't know that was coming. Now we're on plan B. Definitely on plan B, or it wasn't his first choice, but he gave him a choice.
Yeah.
And he was rejected.
Yeah, and what's interesting is that we saw the prophets had said that was going to happen.
Right.
And it's not because God made them reject, but he said, I know this is what you're going to do, but he still
made the offer.
He still made the offer. It was a legitimate offer. Here, I'm your king. Here's the kingdom. If you would accept it. They didn't accept it.
Right. So after the rejection, Jesus healed the demon, and then they gave a bigger rejection, or maybe that was a rejection, where they said, he got his power from Satan.
Yeah.
So Jesus, not that he closed down, but he kind of shut down talking to the Jews, and now we're going to find where he starts picking up talking to the Gentiles and start doing more training on his disciples.
Yeah, just for a quick clarification, didn't heal a demon, healed a demon-possessed person, right? I know that's what you meant, right?
Yeah. Hopefully you cleaned that up yourself when you heard that, yeah.
Yeah, so there's this big rejection. He changes his teaching style. He changes his sort of
parables
his method,
come into play.
Right. Yeah. So he's not going to be doing these big mass miracles for the crowds anymore, with a couple exceptions, right?
Right.
He's really focusing down with his the disciples who are going to be his apostles, right?
Right. So one of the first things that happens in chapter 15 is the big guns from Jerusalem come. Mm-hmm. So this means a bunch of things happen. One is the ruling party in the north talks to the ruling party in Jerusalem and said, hey, we got a problem here. You need to send some people.
Yeah.
They took it serious enough that they sent people up. So now we have these people that came from Jerusalem, ideally the experts in the law, Pharisees, Sadducees, and they're talking to Jesus.
Yeah.
And I think it's really interesting. One of the first things they did is they went the same route as the guys in the north did.
Yeah.
The guys in the north were, hey, your disciples are doing some weird stuff. These guys said, hey, your disciples, they're breaking with traditions. In fact, they are breaking the rules. And the hideous thing that they didn't wash their hands.
Yeah.
And you're like,
before they ate something, right? Yeah.
Yeah, but it's a tradition, and they recognize that it was a tradition and said it was a tradition, but they're making a big deal out of it, like it's a law.
Yeah.
And they're like, who are you that they can break our traditions? And I love Jesus's response. Jesus' response is, who are you that you're not following God's laws?
The actual law. So we may be breaking tradition, but you don't even follow the law, right? And he calls that out. One point I'd like to make is that the fact that they're coming from Jerusalem, these religious leaders, shows, and again, Matthew sort of building this out, right? So this is no longer just a regional rejection. If it were just regional, Jesus could go somewhere else and maybe they'd be fine.
Good point.
This is national now. This is Jerusalem saying, we don't accept you.
Right.
Not much else, nowhere else to go in Israel once like you said, the big guns, start shooting them down.
So it's, how big a deal is this, right? They're not washing their hands. It's tradition. But the major point in my mind is, even 2,000 years ago, the ruling party was putting traditions over the Bible.
Yeah.
They were putting them at a higher level.
Yep.
Even if they put them at the same level, it's still a problem.
It's still a problem, right? Yeah.
Yeah. And we find that some churches do that today too, right? Can I move the piano? Well, that was a big one, 20, 30 years ago when bringing in a drum set. Yeah. We've always had it there. We've always done this. Yeah, but it's not it's not a law. It's not a.
Yeah.
It's just a tradition.
So churches do it, organizations do it, families do it, individuals. You know what my preferences
Christmas
are
traditions.
over something. Yeah, yeah. You know, how do you set up your Christmas tree? Or do
Oh,
you
that's
do
wrong.
Yep. Can't do that.
We put a pickle on ours. You gotta find the pickle. Yeah. All right. So then Jesus talked to the crowd about defiling and defilement.
Yeah.
And later he explains, guys, you know, you're not getting it, to the disciples.
Yeah.
And it was almost from a parable standpoint, you know, and he's explaining it. He goes, it doesn't matter what you put in, you know, what you eat. He goes, what matters is what comes out, right? The words you say.
Yeah.
And that's where the hatred comes out. That's where the slander comes out. That's where the lies come out.
Yeah.
And that's the problem. It's not that, you know, you ate a grape.
Which is interesting because under the law which they were living under, what you ate did make you unclean. Right. What Jesus was saying was, listen, it doesn't defile you in the sense of like corrupting you. There is a ceremonial uncleanness or whatever, but it's not going to, you know, it's not going to hurt you if you do these things. There's something else going on there, which also sets up in Acts chapter 10 when God said to Peter, you know, go and kill and eat these things. Yeah. He's like, oh, I would never do anything. It's like, come on, that's, you know,
right,
changing things here. So
yeah. So Jesus goes into a Gentile area, and a lady came up and wanted her child healed, and Jesus said no because she wasn't Jewish.
Yeah,
and I think it's one of those, Jesus knew exactly what he was doing. It wasn't that he wasn't going to heal. He just wanted to present a contrary argument to her and let her see what she was going to do with it.
Yeah, it's really interesting. She came at him like using all the right words, oh, son of David and all this stuff, which doesn't mean anything to a Gentile. She's a Canaanite, right? It wasn't until she just broke down and said, Lord, would you please help? He's like, see, now that's the kind of heart that I'm looking for. You know, it wasn't the fancy words. It wasn't the script. It wasn't all the stuff, right?
Yeah, and Jesus even says, wait, I came here for the Jews.
Yeah.
And she said, well, doesn't a dog even get the table scraps or the scraps and crumbs from the table?
Yeah, and I think that's so amazing. And it doesn't say that he was amazed. We've talked about that in the past, you know, but he does say that she had great faith. Just like the centurion, who's also a Gentile, and great faith, as I said, comes from great humility. And that's what she was really demonstrating, was she's like, you know, I'm not asking for much. I'm just asking for a crumb. Do you have a leftover crumb? I know what you can do. I'm not asking for much.
Just want a leftover miracle.
Yeah, just if you have something that you're not using, you know, it's just very, very cool.
It is.
And we keep on going with, you mentioned Gentiles, right? So we're going to see for the rest of chapter 15 really some big Gentile stuff going.
Yeah, well, the biggest is next, right?
Yeah.
Jesus feeds 4,000.
Yeah.
So Jesus, it's very similar to the feeding of the 5,000.
Yep.
Right, going to a remote location. All these people come in. This would have happened over many days, and in fact, I think it says after 3 days, people were getting a little hungry.
Yeah.
And that means the food they brought had run out by that time. And very similar, it's like, hey, send these people away. And Jesus says, no, we're going to feed them. Mm-hmm. And the disciples seem confused.
Yeah.
And I think part of that is the confusion where people think, oh, it's just a retelling of the 5,000.
Yep.
I think the reason that the disciples were confused was these are now Gentiles.
These are Gentiles.
Yeah, why would we be feeding Gentiles?
Yeah, why are we messing around with it?
Still the Jewishness in the disciples that Jesus seems to be trying to get out.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right? So they end up feeding 4,000 men. Again, there would have been many more women and children there.
Yep.
And then Jesus moves into a more Jewish area after that.
Yep.
In chapter 16, the Sadducees and Pharisees came together to test Jesus. So right now, you know something's up because these two guys don't like each other, right? The Pharisees and Sadducees traditionally butt heads with each other.
Yeah.
So if they're ganging up on people, there's a reason for that. They asked Jesus for a sign. And Jesus is frankly done giving them a sign, right? He has been rejected at this point, and he keeps going back to, I'm just going to give you the sign of Jonah. And if we go back to the story of Jonah, Jonah was in a big fish for 3 days and then came out. Jesus kind of equating to that is, my sign's going to be, I'm going to die and in 3 days come back to life.
Yeah, I'll be in the heart of the earth for 3 days. 3 days and 3 nights is a very Jewish phrase. Matthew's the only one who uses it. Everybody else typically says on the third day. And so there's a Hebraism that goes into that. We don't really have time to get into all the detail, but it doesn't necessarily mean 72 hours exactly. It can be any part of, right? So it's the third day is what he's talking about there.
So as they're walking to these areas, there's always a lot of time to talk, and Jesus is talking and instructing his disciples, and they had a conversation that basically came down to Jesus saying, who do you think I am?
Yeah.
Right. And he starts off with, who do others say I am? And then he gets down to, who do you say I am?
Yeah.
And Peter, right? Peter comes back with, you are the Christ.
Which means Messiah.
Yeah.
Which is big in Matthew's audience. You're the Messiah, the Son of the living God.
Yeah, Son of the living God.
Yeah.
And Jesus gives him an answer that really has many parts to it.
Yeah.
One part is, man, you're blessed because you didn't get that from yourself. My Father gave it to you.
Yeah,
God
this is
gave
a
it
spiritual
to you.
truth. Yeah.
Then Jesus says, on this rock I will build, what does he say? My church.
Yeah.
So there's a whole bunch of stuff in here, right? There's prophecy. Jesus is going to build something. Hades cannot overcome it.
Yep.
That's also something that hasn't happened yet, but prophecy that is fulfilling.
Yep.
And then there's always a question about on this rock and what does that mean. Some people think it means Peter because that was part of his name. I think we go with more that it's Jesus.
Jesus himself is the rock.
Yeah. And back to the stumbling or the cornerstone and the stumbling block.
That. Which is what Peter says in 1 Peter chapter 2. I mean, he identifies Jesus as the rock. So, if he was there. Right.
And then he ends this with, don't tell anybody.
Yeah.
And this wasn't a don't tell anybody forever. It was just, hey, I just want you to keep it on the down low for a while. You're going to remember it later, and that's fine.
Yeah.
Jesus then goes into, and I think we find at least 3 times, where he clearly explains his death and resurrection.
Yeah.
And he's telling his disciples, here's what's going to happen. So this wasn't a one and done type of deal. And I got to believe the first time the disciples heard it, it's kind of in one ear and out the other. Oh, that's not going to happen. He's the Messiah.
Right.
How can that happen?
Yeah, Peter, in fact, came off of this big spiritual win. Jesus says, I'm going to give you the keys to the kingdom, which is just it was a short term, it was a temporary thing that we see Peter fulfill in Acts. Right. And Peter's like, come here, Jesus, we need to have a little talk here. It says Peter actually rebuked him, don't talk like that.
Yeah.
And Jesus turns and says, get behind me, Satan, right? What's interesting, the word Satan means adversary, okay? In Matthew chapter 4, Satan's big push, the big 3, was his big push was, you can have the kingdom without having to go through all this stuff. If you just bow down and worship me, I'll give you the whole world, right?
Right.
What was Peter saying here?
Yeah, same thing, really.
You can have the kingdom without having to go through all this stuff. It wasn't that Jesus was calling him, you are Satan, or, Satan had possessed Peter or something. Yeah. If you take the word Satan and get rid of it as a name and just use it as a descriptor and means adversary, he's saying you are doing the same thing. You are standing opposed to me right now. You think you're helping me. You are actually setting yourself up as my enemy right now by tempting me to not go through with what I'm supposed to go through with. Good. It's really important. Right. Really important thing.
The end of this section, Jesus says, I tell you the truth, some of you will not die before seeing the Son of Man come into this kingdom.
Yeah. Right. Which is, it seems like that, that's the end of chapter 16, and now we go into chapter 17. It's actually fulfilled in the first few verses of 17. It actually goes with 17 better than it goes with chapter 16. It's really interesting. It was fulfilled in the Transfiguration.
Yeah, and again, the chapters and verses put in by man instead. So chapter 17 starts with 6 days later.
Yeah.
So we're 6 days after this happened.
Yep.
Peter, James, and John go to Jesus on a high mountain, and Jesus is transfigured, which really means what?
Well, in this case, he was glowing, I guess is the best way to put it. The glory, his true nature, his divine being, is showing.
Or at least part of it.
Showing, right. The glory of God is showing at that point.
And then Moses and Elijah show up.
Yep.
Which that had to be tough to take, and we make fun of Peter again during this part, but how freaked out would you be?
Yeah,
right.
So he's talking, and God
he's
says,
trying to make things right.
Listen. But what we have here is
and then God makes an appearance.
Yeah, we have the promise. There are some standing here who will not experience death until they see the Son of Man coming in the kingdom. 6 days later, 3 of them saw a glimpse of the kingdom.
Right.
You have Jesus in his glory. You've got 2 Old Testament saints who are standing there. You can talk to them just like in the kingdom.
Right.
You've got God speaking just like in the kingdom. And what you have is the apostles represented there. So the church is represented. You have the Old Testament saints. You have prophets. You have Moses as the lawgiver. You have a little microcosm of the kingdom right there. And what Jesus said has been fulfilled.
Right. So they come back down the mountain, and there's a crowd, and the other disciples were trying to heal the son of somebody who had a bunch of seizures, but they failed. Right. They couldn't bring a demon out of a person. So Jesus rebukes the demon, and the demon comes out of him. And then the disciples are like, "How come we weren't able to do that?" And Jesus said it was their lack of faith that they couldn't heal this son.
Yeah. So what is lack of faith is lack of humility. Lack of humility is pride. So this man came to see Jesus. Well, Jesus is busy. We can take care of it for you. And they couldn't. And it was a pride thing for them.
Jesus tells the disciples for a second time he's going to be killed and resurrected. At least 3 of the disciples seem to have a better understanding. They were distressed was what came on there. Then there's a discussion going on in chapter 18, and we just go through verse 14 in this week's reading. But the disciples ask, "Who's the greatest in the kingdom of heaven?" And I read that word kingdom to be the Messianic kingdom, or the 1,000-year.
Kingdom of heaven is talking about Messiah's kingdom.
And the rules are going to be different for these 1,000 years than there are for us in there, even though we will be there as part of that 1,000 years. So there's words like humble yourself, don't be the stumbling block. I mean, those make sense in Jewish terms. Also, don't cut off your hand and feet. Or if your hand and feet are causing you problems and causing you to sin, it's better that you get rid of them. Which we say, well, that's what we should do as Christians. But if our hands and feet are causing us to sin and we cut them off, how is our sin forgiven?
And it doesn't really have anything to do with that. It says it's better for you to enter into life, which is the kingdom, crippled, than have your hands and feet and be thrown into eternal fire. The thing is the Christian is never in danger of eternal fire. There is no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus. So it's not applicable in that way. If somebody doesn't chop off their hand or whatever, pluck out their eye, they're going to go to hell. You don't go to hell because you did a particular sin and didn't chop off your hand.
And that's why we accept Christ in the first place.
So his death and resurrection, which had not happened yet, he's still talking to people who are under the law, who are looking forward to the kingdom. The church, chapters 16 through 20, Jesus is working with his apostles to help prepare them for a church age that nobody saw coming. But he's still talking to people who don't know anything about it. He's still talking about the kingdom. He's still talking to Jews who are under the law.
We end this week with the parable of the lost sheep. And it was like Man, I hope we end there.
Yeah.
There is a longer version of the story in Luke in chapter 15.
Yep.
But the key point is, okay, let's say you got 100 sheep and you lose one.
Yeah.
Right? What are you going to do? You're going to set those 99 aside, make sure they're safe in a pen. You're going to go out to look for that one sheep.
Yep.
And when you find them, you're going to have a huge celebration.
Bring it back. Yeah.
Yeah.
A lot of people like to use this, and like you said, the longer version, the lost coin and the lost son or the prodigal son for evangelism, right?
Yep.
We got to go talk to unsaved people, but that's not what it's about, because the lost sheep was one of the 100, wandered away and came back. The lost coin was one of the 10, rolled away and was found and came back. The lost son was already a son, and walked away and came back. So what we're really talking about is, in the context, the Jewish people who had just become cynical or jaded about the Messiah, about the law, and they wandered away. They're not obeying the law anymore. And Jesus says, I'm trying to bring you back into the fold. You were here once, right? So maybe we would talk about that as discipleship or sanctification or something, but it's not
evangelistic.
It's not really an evangelistic passage the way some people like to use it.
Yeah. So we just went through 3.5 chapters. I think it was 3.5 in a very short period of time. We could have spent hours more on it. That's what you can do when you read, right? So like always, take your time when you're reading this.
Yeah, and ask questions. If there's stuff that you're like, oh, I wish they would have talked about that, and ask the questions. We'd be happy to answer those for you, respond to those. In the meantime, enjoy it. We're reading in sections over the course of the week, and next week we'll come back. We'll tackle a couple of more chapters in this section where Jesus is preparing them for the next phase. Yeah.
Yep.
So
Good.
see you then.
Bye, everybody.